World War I started on June 28, 1914, after Archduke Ferdinand of the Austria-Hungary Empire was assassinated by Serbian nationalists. Within a month, the continent of Europe was at war. Until this point in history, the United States had pledged isolation in all European affairs. Wilson continued this trend by stating that the U.S. would remain neutral in the war and trade with both the Central Powers and the Triple Entity on August 4, 1914. Even though America pledged to stay out of the war, sides began to emerge between those with strong European ties, mainly the first and second generation of foreign immigrants. Even though these citizens called for an entrance into the war, the majority of Americans wanted to remain neutral. This opinion began to change in May 7, 1915, when the Lusitania, a British passenger liner, was sunk by German U-boats. On this ship were many Americans, and 128 of them were killed in the incident. This caused outrage in the United States, and many began to call for entrance into the war against the Germans. In later years, it was determined that the Lusitania was sunk because of war contraband in its hold. At the time, British ships would smuggle in weapons from their colonies to help support the war in Europe. This incident created a field day for the American media. Even though Americans still wanted to remain out of the war, many of the newspapers pushed for violence with Germany. The New York Times especially emphasized the need for American involvement in Europe. Tensions between America and Europe continued to escalate through the following years as more and more passenger liners were sunk by U-boats. The hostilities came to a head on January 31, 1917, when Germany announced that it would proceed with unrestricted U-boat warfare and all ships making for Britain could potentially be sunk. Wilson once again urged Congress to keep the United States neutral, but the public began to side with those wanting to go to war against Germany. America managed to continue its message of neutrality, but a massive blow to the Central Powers came when British intelligence passed a German message to the American government on February 23, 1917. This message was from the Mexican Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico, Hendrik von Eckardt. We intend to begin unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor to keep the United States neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis. Make war together, make peace together. Generous financial support and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. This message was published in many American newspapers, and the public immediately called for Congress to declare war against Germany. Wilson finally agreed that there was no other choice but to join the Allied powers against Germany. The official declaration of war was issued on April 6, 1917. One of Congress's first acts after declaring war was to appoint John J. Pershing General of the United States Forces in Europe. After the appointment of Pershing, it became apparent that the U.S. might not have sufficient armed forces to send to Europe. At the time, approximately 516,000 men were in the American armed forces, but Pershing had wanted 678,000. These worries caused the Congress to institute a draft for the first time since the Civil War. The draft created a massive stream of both voluntary and non-voluntary recruits as 9.5 million Americans registered to join the war. When the American forces first arrived in Europe, they were met by skeptical French soldiers who had been fighting in a stalemate for the past few years. Many of the American soldiers were inexperienced, especially to trench warfare that had been decimating the European countryside. These concerns were pushed aside by Pershing, who quickly established his headquarters near the front at the Marne. Upon viewing the battlefield, Pershing realized how costly the war would be. He requested an additional 3 million men from the War Department. The department did not take this estimate too seriously, however, and discarded the request. The first American push came at the Marne on June 6 at the Marne front. The addition of the American soldiers proved to be the turning point in the war. The sheer amount of American soldiers allowed the Allies to push the Marne front to the Aisne River, away from the threatened French capital of Paris. The offensive lasted until August 6, but showed the Germans the power of the American forces. After the Marne offensive, Pershing requested the other Allied generals for an American-only offensive to truly show America's potential as a world power. He was granted the request, and Pershing took control of 19 American divisions at St. Mihiel. The following offensive on September 12th was a complete success, with German forces being routed and 200 square miles of French territory being liberated. But it was not without its cost, as the offensive resulted in 7,000 American casualties. As the war began to die down in October of 1918, many of the German leaders were beginning to lose their nerve as the addition of American forces began to push the once steady German lines back towards Germany itself. This then led to talks of peace between the Allies and the Central Powers. Those talks did not stop the war, however, as the last American offensive took place near the Argonne Forest. This area of the front was extremely difficult to take as the Germans were now fighting out of desperation. The Americans eventually began to advance and managed to reclaim an area up to the Meuse River. It was then, on November 11, 1918, that a ceasefire was called, and the Great War came to an end. But what was the result of the war? America had not gained any territory due to their presence in the international conflict. No, it did not get land. Rather, America emerged from the war as a world power and the savior of the war, for it is impossible to tell how long the war would have lasted had the American forces not been there to push against the German lines.